Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today, no matter what it is you're doing. For the free wire tutorial today on YouTube, I'd like to share my Valentine Cascade Earrings with you. It's a beautiful way to get used to utilising wire and also to practice some key techniques which are entirely transferable to your other projects. I've made mine with some cute little faceted purple jade. Let's head down to the board and take a closer look at those earrings. So here's the first of our Valentine Cascade earrings already made up, and we'll use this as a template for sizes when we create the second half of that pair. Let's just get that to cascade down on the board. And let's talk about what materials we're going to need today. So I have 5 head pins. They don't need to be terribly long. I also have 5 beads. These are 6mm faceted purple dyed jade, and I have a pair of ear wires in a complementary colour. One's already in use and one's here just to help us out in a few minutes. In terms of wire and raw materials, we're going to be working with 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and I have a long length of 10 inches and a short length of 2 inches. I also have some scrap pieces of 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire, which we will use to help us out along the way. Let's get started with the main piece of this design. So we're going to make ourselves a frame, and if you are making earrings, it does pay to do them in piecework. So just make the frame first, then add on all your bits and bobs and your infill, one section by one section, and in that way you're much more able to control the symmetry of your design. So again, it's 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and I have approximately 10 inches. I'm going to start by giving that a lovely warm through to begin with, just to make our creative aspect a little bit easier. We will be starting in the approximate centre of that wire, and I'm going to be using some round nose pliers to help me create these little loops onto which we're going to add those beads a little bit later on. So what we want to do, as you can see, that's not directly in the centre, but I'm not overly worried. I'm just going to start by creating a small loop into a V shape at the bottom. Now I do like to try and keep the loops on my cascading designs as similar as possible, so you can take a lot more pains than I am in this tutorial to make sure that those are the same size. You could, for instance, pop a mark on your pliers to denote whereabouts that little loop is being formed, or you could of course use a set of bail making pliers like this one. This has got a 4mm loop on one side, and you could recreate the exact same size loop a little bit more easily, but you can achieve the same aspect with your standard round nose pliers. So I'm just going to make sure that I'm happy with that form and give it a little bit of strength while I'm moving through the process. So what we need to do is just see where our next loops need to be, and to try and match the angle that we have created in the first piece. So you can see my angle's a little bit wider on this one, so I'm just going to tighten that up slightly and get that to sit more equally. We're then going to add on loops at the various points. Now if you're making this design one section at a time, it's a little bit easier than referring to a completed piece. Now let's draw that wire all the way around. And you'll need to check the distances between those loops as well. So we'll start off with a rough loop to begin with, and let's just pop that over the top and see if that's the same kind of size and positioning. That's Joey dog having a bit of a bark, just don't worry about him. He's a little bit neurotic. So I've got my loop in the position where it will need to occur on the design, and I also need to ensure that that is nice and flat on that straight line. So I'm just going to take a second to straighten that out and make sure that I'm happy overall with that loop. Now when I'm making a design like this to create these cascade earring findings, we're creating a frame onto which you can do almost anything a little bit later. You can add infill, you don't have to add infill, you can add big beads, you can add chain, scraps, all kinds of things. What I tend to do is get my loops done one side and then the other side as well, and in that way I can slightly better control the distances between those loops. So let's just spin that wire around and try to get that to sit in approximately the same position. So I'm going to give that a squish, and you can see that the wire is coming away at a funny angle. So we want to control that. We want to have straight lines above the loops that we're creating. So I've just pushed that up gently, And we're going to try that for size against our other earring. Now my loop on the right hand side there is just slightly too far along that line. Now the reason I have done that is because I can show you how easy it is to move that loop along, just a tiny amount, and then you re-straighten that line coming away, and you can re-sight where that loop sits on your component that you're creating. So let's get back to those round nose pliers and get the last loop on either side done. I'm going to bring that around, and then the wire is going to cross back, and I'm trying to keep it parallel at the moment to the baseline on the other side. So we've got a baseline with loops on either side, and then we've got this straight line. We will be adjusting that in a moment, but for now it helps me to keep my eye on the loops and to see if they need to move at all. So this is again a little bit too far to the right, so we can move that down just a little bit by rotating those pliers around and then pulling that top wire very gently until we get that to sit exactly how we want it to sit. Now the positioning of the loop is correct, but the angle is wrong. So I'm not going to worry about the angle for now. I just want to make sure that those loops are sitting in the same position, because we're making pairs of earrings. You can of course make a cascade pendant rather, in which case you won't have to faff around quite so very much. So let's add that last loop in. You can rotate the pliers around to draw that into position, and again at this stage we're just looking to make sure that the loops are sitting in the right place. Again, it's a little bit high, so let's draw that down ever so slightly and then bring the wire back across and just make sure that those loops are sitting in the right position. Still a little bit high, and you can adjust this and go a little bit more slowly than I am. I don't want you to get bored. So if you do have a little bit of a kink in that wire, we do want to keep that nice and straight. So once you've got your loop in position, we're going to straighten that wire up as it comes forwards and upwards. So overall, for the purposes of demonstration, I'm quite happy with how that's looking. What we need to do now is to create this wrapped loop and closed loop up at the top. And we want that to be in the same kind of size. So I'm just going to very gently draw the wires up a little bit so that I get that height to make sure that the crossover takes place at the same position. A way that you can do this, let's just draw that wire across slightly, hold that in position, and I can see that this is where I would want my wire to cross over. So if I put that cross in position, I then don't have to hold the piece over the top of the one that we're tracing the other one. So now I can just draw these wires across. In order for this to be symmetrical, this distance to here should be the same as this distance to the point at which we're going to make this line into an upright, and in that way you'll get some element of symmetry in your design. So if I just grip that long tail of wire that's going across at a tangent and pull that into an upright, if I put it down on the board, imagining this is a clock face, we have now got a straight line going up at 12 o'clock. We've got one crossing over the front, heading off towards the 9 o'clock position. If I pick the piece up and grip just past that sharp angle going across to the 9 o'clock, I'm going to hold that wire just after the angle that we made, and I'm going to push the wire all the way around that upright, or that 12 o'clock wire. So you can see, if I just push that out of form for a moment, you can see I've made a little bit of a loop. And what this does is it sets the size. So you can, of course, at this stage check again. Looks a little bit short. I'm not going to overly worry about it, but you could take that up slightly further if you needed to. So let's just straighten that wire out, grip across the two side wires. Now I'm gripping very, very gently, one side wire and the other side wire. I'm not pressing down where any wires cross over. What I am going to do now, though, is take the tail all the way around that upright, that 12 o'clock position, and draw it around the same number of times as I have on my first piece. So from the front, that's 3 wraps. And then we take across the back and we just trim away. Now I'm going to trim that wire quite short, because you can see that there's a little bit of bagginess in my wrapping just here. And if I want to fix that, what I might do is grab a second pair of flat chain nose pliers rather. I'm just going to grip across the design again, making sure I'm only holding on single sections of wire. But this gives me an opportunity to use a second pair of pliers to just tighten that little wrap up at the top to make sure it's super neat and tidy. Like so. And we're still finishing with the cut wire only visible at the back there. Oops. And there we go. So we've got two reasonably symmetrical pieces for our framework. Now, because I'm making earrings today, you do have the opportunity, you've got plenty of wire to make a wrapped loop up at the top. However, because there's not a huge amount of weight on this design, I'm going to make an open and closable simple loop. You have enough wire to make a wrapped loop if you wish to. I am trying to preserve a little bit of weight on the design because not everybody likes heavy earrings, and we're already working in a 1mm or 18 gauge wire, so I don't want to overdo the weight on this design. So what I'm going to do is pull the wire over to one side. Let's just tighten that up slightly. Pull the wire over to one side like so, and then use my round nose pliers to make a loop that is as similar as possible to the one that I made on the first half. So that's rotated around. Like I said, if you wanted to make a wrapped loop, you've got plenty of wire to play with. I, however, am going to go for a simple loop. So look twice, cut once. Managed to knock the earrings as well as the heart tray. Joey's having a moment. Oh gosh, it's all going. So once I've got my loop shape and it's been cut, I'm going to flatten that down so that it sits like a nice loop shape. Make sure that everything is flat and I'm happy. I'm only very, very gently adjusting things at this stage. And then what I'm going to do is put some strength into that loop shape up at the top. You could, if you have a fine aim, very gently hammer up here. Well, what I'm doing is disrupting the shape of the loop up at the top and really squishing it so that it's good and strong. It's plenty strong enough to support some light jade beads and the little bit of wire work I'm doing. If you want to do a wrapped loop, you do have the option there with that excess wire. For the next part of our tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make the heart infill so that you can take a basic form such as this, from which you could simply add chain or dangly beads and just add a little bit more of a love heart inspired theme. For the next part of the tutorial, I'm going to be working primarily with scraps from my scrap pot. So I have a little bit of 0.4 or 26 gauge wire to tie everything together later, and I have a 2-inch length of 18 gauge or 1mm wire. This is a scrap from my scrap pot, so I just need to make sure that it's going to be flexible enough to create the small heart shape to add the Valentine's aspect to our Valentine Cascade earrings. So I've given that a bit of a warm through, and again I'm just working with basic round nose pliers. However, if you prefer, you could use those bail makers. I need to start in the centre of my short section of wire and just create a crossover. Now when you're working with a short scrap of wire, you can see it's slightly longer on the right hand side, so all I'm going to do is just use the right hand side more to form that middle crossover, and this is almost exactly the same way as we created the bottom of the earring finding itself. So I'm going to cross those over, and if I get the same amount of wire on both sides, I can then simply use both sides to open out slightly. So we have that central point of our little swirly heart down at the base, and what I want to do, once I'm sure that I'm happy with the size of that loop, is I just need to twist it very gently. At the moment, because we're working with a 1mm wire, you've got a crossover point, which means that the right hand side of this loop is higher than the left hand side by 1mm, funnily enough. So if I grip that loop and just very gently do a little twist, I can get everything to equalise. And it means that visually that wire down at the bottom is now completely flat to the front of my design, which helps when we're going to tie it together in a little while. So I'm going to use a point a little bit further up my round nose pliers to create the heart shape. If you're working with scraps of wire, do make sure that they are indeed the same length before you start this process. As I've mentioned many times before, when making earrings, I will have two 10-inch lengths cut so that I can make the frames the same size, and I'll do one manoeuvre at a time. With the heart infill for this design, you do need to make sure that your heart wire, this little 2-inch length, are both the same size, because it means that you will have much less stress making the hearts the same size. I think that needs to be slightly larger, so I've just rotated it round a little bit. So let's use the other side of wire, bring those pliers in quite low down on the prong, Now you can see that on the right hand side, the lobe of my heart is ever so slightly lower down. It's also a little bit open. So we've got a little bit of work. So all I'm going to do is just very, very gently manipulate this design until it closely resembles the other one. At least if you're wearing them on different sides of the head, it won't be too important if it's not absolutely perfect. But let's just offer that down and see if it's close enough. I would say it's close enough for us not to worry about it. Obviously you'll make yours exactly step by step at the same time, and then you won't have to worry. Once you're happy with the overall form and shape, I'm going to add a little bit of strength to this design. Now I'm not going to squash down at that crossover point, I'm just going to hold on to that, but I am going to squish, squash and squash, whichever way you want to think of it, very firmly down on both lobes of the heart to get that shape nice and strong. Now of course if you do excel at the art of soldering, I don't, then you can obviously solder those ends and create a slightly stronger form. But we can just use wire to make sure that we're happy with this design and that it matches as closely as possible. One of the main things that happens with this design is that your heart doesn't fit in the frame. Now as it happens, because we followed along, that's a reasonably close facsimile. If for some reason your heart is a little bit too narrow, for instance there's too much of a gap between the side and the lobes of the heart, you can simply open them out slightly. So what you would need to do is just very gently coerce those apart, and then they should fit in neatly. The other reason for doing that little bit of a twist down at this part of our heart decal is that it's much easier to wire wrap it to the frame itself. And that brings us neatly on to the next stage of today's tutorial. So I have a scrap length here. It's about 3 inches, but I'm just literally grabbing scraps from my pot. You can see the end's a bit mucky. I wouldn't use scraps to make jewellery to sell, but in terms of demonstration pieces, it's perfectly adequate. I'm going to start around about halfway along this short length, 3 inches or so, of 26 gauge or 0.4mm wire, and I'm going to wrap it 3 times neatly around the inside of the base of that heart. Now you may benefit from using some pliers to help you get a nice tight neat coil in this position. So we've got 2 wraps so far. Getting my thumb out of the way is much more difficult than actually just doing it. So I'm going to take a 3rd turn around that little bit of wire down at the base there. Once we've got a nice neat 3 wrap going on down in the base, let me just hold that up so you can see it. 3 wraps around the central section at the base, we're going to start applying it to our frame. Now for this piece, I have just wrapped once around the heart and the frame, and then 3 times around the frame. So because my wire on the right hand side is underneath, I'm going to slide that underneath the frame as well. And I'm just going to ignore the piece on the left hand side for a moment. And what we're going to do is wrap 1 time around the heart decal and the frame. So let's take the tail of that wire and post it inside that little heart loop down at the bottom. Pull that all the way through, nice and neat and tidy. And we want the 2 sections of wire, the heart decal and the frame, to sit side by side. And then we're going to draw that tail of wire through and wrap it 3 times around just the frame. Now you could wrap more than once, but what I found in doing demonstrations that it's much harder to see what I'm doing if I over wrap it. So I'm keeping it simple, and I'm going for 1 wrap to hold the heart decal to the frame, and then 3 wraps either side. So let's take that wire through 1 last time. And this is the front of my design as we're looking at it. On the back we've got the cut end of wire, so we don't want to look at that. This is the front. I'm going to tighten those loops up, and I'm just going to hold that wire out of the way for a second. It's much easier for me to flip the design over. You'll see that your heart can still rotate at this point. Let me just show you what I mean. We're not going to worry about that because we're going to have 2 further points of wire wrapping in a moment. So I'm going to then bring that wire all the way around, and you can see we then have 1 visible wrap between the heart decal and the frame, and then the tail of wire needs to wrap 3 times around just the frame. So this will look different on the back than it does from the front. So we just need to make sure that we are looking at the front side of our frame. And then I'm massacring the wire as I go because I know I'm about to cut it away at the rear. So we've got 3 wraps around the centre of that heart loop, 1 wrap around the heart loop and the frame, and then 3 wraps on either side onto the frame itself. When I get over onto the back, what I need to do is trim the end of the wire as close to the inside of the frame as possible. And I'll do that on both sides. Now these bits of wire finally can go off and be melted. And what we're going to do is just tidy up those last little wraps by making sure that they sit snugly down against that frame wire. And the end should be inside the frame wherever possible, because then it isn't a problem to look at it. And what you'll see is it looks very different on the back to how it does on the front, and we want to focus on the symmetry of the front. So I'm just going to give that a little bit of a snidge to make sure that it sits neatly. You can adjust the heart if you need to. Still got a little bit of fluidity in where it sits, and then we're going to wrap on in exactly the same way. So I will wrap 3 times to the frame, 1 time around the frame and the heart, and then 3 times on the frame on the other side. I'm just going to show you that once. I'm just going to grab another scrap of wire. And again, this is just a couple of inches of 26 gauge or 0.4mm, and I'll show you that very, very quickly on one side. You can just allow the heart to come out of the way if you want it to. And as I said, I'm going to wrap 3 times around the frame to begin with. So let's just take that tail and draw it around. That's 1 visible wrap, 2 visible wraps. Coming up next, rotate your pliers around to tighten up that wire. And then try to make sure that the end of the wire sits inside the frame where possible. So I have my 3 wraps around the frame. I'm then going to bring my heart into position. My coil of wire can go up and down if it needs to. I haven't quite smushed that end. There we go. So then we're going to wrap 1 time around the frame and the lobe of the heart. Push that all the way through. Pull that up into position. Nice and neat and tidy. And then we go for 3 more wraps around the frame. So that's 1 wrap, 2 wraps, and a 3rd wrap. We're going to trim just a little bit past the end there. And then I'm going to push that end so that it sits inside the frame. And just tighten up those coils very gently before giving it a very soft little squish. You can move that up and down a little bit if you need to, and all I will do is repeat on the other side, and that should take us to the point at which we're ready to add our beads. So I've just finished by wrapping on the 2nd lobe of the heart to the frame. Everything's looking pretty secure. All that remains is to add on the beads to complete our Valentine Cascade earrings. So to complete the design, I have 5 head pins. They're standard weight rather than featherweight, and the reason I've chosen standard weight is because my beads have got large drill holes and they simply slid right off my featherweight head pins. The stronger your head pin, the fewer the wraps you need if you're choosing to use a wrapped loop, which is what I'm going to show you today. You could use a simple loop if you're using a lovely heavy head pin as well. It's entirely up to you which way you go. So here's the first of my 5 head pins. Let's introduce the bead. I'm using a 6mm faceted dyed purple jade. I'm then going to grab my bent chain nose pliers and choose a point on those pliers which I will either mark with a marker pen or remember before I turn a right angle. And the reason that I do this at the exact same distance along those pliers is because they're tapered, and it means I can have a little production line of similarly sized bead tassels. So I've already made the loop shape on these ones, but I wanted to show you the reasoning why I do what I do. So to create that loop shape again, you could put marker pen on your round nose pliers or use bail makers. I'm just going to rotate around until I get the first half of a hook shape, and then draw the tail of wire over. And now I have 5 of these ready to be introduced into my cascade earrings. So let's slide that on through so that it sits through the loop, and I'll show you that again if you're brand new to wire work. When I make the loop, there is usually a little bit of a gap. You can see the airspace just there. If that is flat for you, then it's really easy to just very gently open that out. And all I'm going to do is grip half of the side and just very, very gently create a little bit of space. When I make that loop shape around my round nose pliers, I do tend to make it in a slightly more helical design rather than a perfectly circular, because it gives you this really lovely access point and makes it super easy for you to slip into position. So we're just going to allow that to slide down until it sits inside the loop that we created. I'm then going to hold on to the loop itself on the bead dangle, and I'm holding across that round form, not interrupting the loop on my earring frame and not squashing where the wires cross over. And all I'm going to do now is rotate that wire around, hopefully 3 times, so that it matches all of the other ones. Just checking to see this is the back, and that's where I want the wire to be cut away, the excess wire from my little head pin. So let's get that out of the way, and then we're just going to squish down that little bit at the back there so that it sits flat against the central part. And if I pop this back onto the front side, let's just pop that down flat, you'll see that the dingly dangly bit looks really neat and tidy once you've taken a moment to just tidy up that wrapped loop. All you would need to do is repeat that 5 times, and then we're going to introduce our earring finding. Now I'm working today in soft raw copper wire, and I found some ear wires that I've had in my stash for about 10 years, which are rose gold colour, and that just matches quite nicely. I'm going to open out that ear wire as if I was opening a jump ring, slide my earring into position and close it up. And by the magic of, I'm going to do this in a minute when you're not watching, you will suddenly have a pair of Valentine Cascade earrings. I think they're really pretty. So that is my Valentine Cascade earring tutorial for you. I hope you have a beautiful day. I hope that you enjoy playing with wire, making jewellery, and just have some fun. Do take care, and I look forward to seeing you again here on the Gemhawks YouTube channel very, very soon. Bye for now.